Hey guys, Christian Babcock here from The Hunter's Advantage. Today we're going to be doing a quick broadhead review. The Hunter's Advantage crew shot 8 different deer last season with these broadheads, and we wanted to share our experience with you guys. We have the NAP Thunderhead and 125 grains. Secondly, we have the Rift 2.2 100 grain expandable by Thorn broadheads. And last but not least, we have the Crown by Thorn broadheads, a fixed blade 100 grain. So in this video, I'm gonna share with you our experience with each one of these broadheads, what I like about them, what I dislike about them, and then I'll briefly share which one of these heads I'm gonna continue to shoot in the fall of 2023. Let's get into it. I did wanna say one of the things I cannot stand about arrow and broadhead reviews is people getting a broadhead, shooting into a target a few times, and then giving their opinion on how they think it will perform in a hunting situation. From my experience, you can only determine what a broadhead is going to do by shooting it through an animal and getting actual experience. So before we get too deep into the video, I did just want to share that we have shot every single one of these broadheads into multiple deer. So let's start with the broadhead that I have the most experience with, the NAP Thunderhead 125 grain. So in previous seasons, I had used the NAP Thunderhead in a 100 grain format and shot several deer with it. The reason I was shooting an NAP Thunderhead was my uncle Justin is the guy who got me into bow hunting and taught me pretty much everything I know. He is one of the if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of guys, and I can appreciate that. He's been using the NAP Thunderhead for a lot of seasons, and he convinced me to give it one more try this season, so I did. One of the reasons that I was hesitant to put the NAP Thunderhead back on my arrow setup, I hadn't had great blood trail experiences when shooting deer through one or both lungs. And this isn't some crazy phenomenon. When you're shooting a broadhead that has a much smaller cutting diameter, like a fixed blade, you expect the blood trails to be a little bit worse than the higher cutting diameter expandables that a lot of folks shoot. But even when considering that, the blood trails with these broadheads in the past hadn't been great. But despite my concern, I decided to give the Thunderhead one last try. The first deer that I shot with the Thunderhead this year was a doe on public land in Oklahoma. 3 does come walking up the trail, 25 yards broadside. I pull back and zip an NAP Thunderhead and Exodus MMT Arrow through the deer and basically stick it in the ground behind her. And I watched the deer run about 70 yards and pile up. While I hunted the rest of the evening, when I got down, immediately found my arrow and my nocturnal knock. I followed the blood trail and it was very petering and spotty. There were several spots where there were 10-yard jumps in between me finding blood, and that was when I knew exactly where the animal went. Stuff always looks a little bit different when you're up in the tree and then you get down into a thick area and it just doesn't look the same on the ground. Well, that was this scenario. The further I went into the blood trail, the better that it got, but I still wasn't impressed with the blood trail on a Thunderhead. The second deer that I shot with a Thunderhead this season was a buck in Kansas that was quartering to me quite a bit. I shot this deer at about 25 to 30 yards on the ground, quartering to me, and got a pass through behind the shoulder and exited in the back opposite side hip. And this is one of the reasons that I do enjoy shooting a fixed blade broadhead, is when that deer came in slightly quartering, I didn't hesitate to take the shot, where with an expandable, I might. I know that the arrow that I'm shooting, and with a good fixed blade broadhead, I have a lot of confidence in the penetration that I can get through these animals, and the fixed blade gave me that in this scenario. Shot that buck, ended up running about 70 yards and toppled over. Came back the next morning, literally could not find a speck of blood where the deer was standing, but my arrow was laying there coated in this beautiful dark red liver looking blood. From the spot where the deer was standing when I shot it, I could see the deer dead in the plains, but even though we had a tracking dog, I could not find any blood on the ground, which was kind of nuts. The third deer that I shot with the NAP Thunderhead this season was a 19-inch wide, big Oklahoma 7-pointer. Shot him at about 20 yards, hit him low, ended up hitting him in the heart, and he ran about 30 yards and piled up. This is not a shot that I'm super proud of, but with a good fixed blade broadhead, ran it through both sides of the rib cage, hit the heart. The deer ran 30 yards and 15 seconds later was toppled over. Once again, when I went to look for this buck, the blood trail was not fantastic. Thankfully, I could see exactly where he was laying because he didn't even run out of eyesight, but there was just petering, spotty blood, but it got the job done once again. The last 2 deer that I shot with the Thunderhead this season were 2 does, late season in Oklahoma. Both of them ducked my arrow terribly, ended up hitting them both high lungs, and same old song and dance, same story of the other 3 deer that I shot this season with the 125 grain Thunderhead. Not great blood trail, but I recovered them, and neither of them went probably more than 150 yards. So I can't complain in that front. 5 deer shot this season with the NAP Thunderhead, and 5 deer recovered. And every single one of them was a pass-through. So wrapping up the NAP Thunderhead section here, the pros that I would give you with this Broadhead is it's reliable. It's an extremely simple design. It's just 3 blades and a point. And the last thing I would say about the pros is it stood the test of time. This Broadhead has been around for decades and continues to take out pretty much any big game animal in North America, so I can't complain about that. And like my Uncle Justin said, the NAP Thunderhead is really one of those Broadheads where if it's not broke, don't fix it. Some of the cons that I had with the Thunderhead, and you probably heard them in my hunting stories talking about this Broadhead, is the blood trails were lackluster. If I had to give them a rating, I'd say 5 or 6 out of 10, or the phrase that I like to say quite a bit, decent at best. And then the last con that I would talk about with the Thunderhead is it was somewhat difficult to sight in. These Broadheads do not shoot like a field point. And I know that's one of the reasons that a lot of people move to expandable Broadheads is they don't want to put in the extra work in the tuning and sighting in department because it is that, it's just more work. But in my mind, it was worth it with all the tinkering and making sure that fixed blade was sighted in to my specific sight and tape because the proof was kind of in the pudding. 5 deer shot, 5 deer recovered, 5 pass-throughs. It's hard to argue with that. But if you don't want to spend the extra time sighting in your bow and getting everything micro dialed in, this might not be the Broadhead for you. With that being said, let's move into the second Broadhead, the Thorn Rift 2.2 100 grain expandable. So one thing that I would hope you would notice with all these Broadheads and arrows I'm showing you is they're all used. The arrows are used, the Broadheads are used, they are not in peak condition. The only reason that this Rift 2.2 isn't used is because it still has the shock collar in it. I didn't want to put this Broadhead on the end of the arrow because that's not what it looks like sitting on the end of the arrow. That's what it looks like deployed. This 100 grain Broadhead, it's a 2-blade expandable and it uses a piece of rubber that you pull through both blades and cut off even right there to keep the blades in place. The biggest buck I've ever shot was a mainframe 13 point. He's right over here over my left shoulder. And I delivered the second shot to this buck with this Broadhead this season. It was a hard quartered away shot, hit it right in front of or right at the back hip, and probably got 8 to 10 inches of penetration, which is to be expected when you shoot a deer that far back. There's so many guts, liver, lungs, rib cage, all that stuff to get through, and I'm not expecting a fixed blade, let alone an expandable, to get great penetration in that kind of scenario. But this was the Broadhead that delivered the lethal shot on this buck right here. When I recovered the buck, that was the Broadhead that 100% killed him. Huge 2.5, 3 inch gash in that back hip, and I'm very confident that's what put him down. Peyton Carroll, who's also in the Hunter's Advantage, had a great experience with this Broadhead this season. He shot a buck off of our lease that was also a 6x7 13 point, a big, mature, probably 6.5+ year old deer. He shot at 25 yards, hit right behind the shoulder, I think dug it into that opposite side shoulder. That buck ran about 90 yards and piled up. So no complaints. When Peyton called me on the phone and sent me the video right after he had shot the buck, I think his exact words were, "I rocked him," like that Broadhead tore him up. So he was really impressed with the Rift 2.2, the first buck that he shot with it. Fast forward to Kansas, Peyton is still hunting. He shoots another buck in Kansas on public land with the Rift 2.2. Same story, didn't get a pass through on either of these deer, but stuck it in the ribs. That deer runs about 100 yards and piles up. So 3 deer shot with the Rift 2.2, 3 deer recovered. The 2 blood trails that Peyton had when he shot both of his bucks were fantastic. This big cutting diameter on this broadhead does give you a lot of peace of mind in the blood trail department, and sometimes you're going to be following the red carpet up to these deer. I didn't have a great blood trail when I was recovering my 6x7, but I shot the deer in the guts, so I wasn't really expecting a great blood trail there. I believe the Broadhead did exactly what you could expect out of that kind of shot placement. So pros of the Rift 2.2. From my perspective, when I shot this and was sighting it in, it was extremely accurate. Pretty much no tuning required, switching from a 100 grain field tip to this Broadhead. Another pro is if you want to check exactly how this Broadhead is going to shoot at your setup, there's a portion of the tip right here where a safety collar can go around the Broadhead and make it where the blades don't deploy when you shoot. So that's really nice. You can shoot the exact Broadhead without dulling the blades, and you'll know exactly where it's going to shoot out of your setup. And the last pro of the Rift 2.2 is probably the cutting diameter and the blood trails. I think you will struggle to have penetration with this Broadhead because it is slowing it down so much with those big blades. But if you get any penetration at all, you're talking about a really big hole that you're punching in these animals. A 2.2 inch cut. It's pretty impressive when it works out. Some of the cons of the Rift 2.2, I think, are out of the 3 shots that we had, none of them were pass-throughs, and I wasn't expecting mine to be a pass-through. But the 2 bucks that Peyton shot completely broadside, neither of those were pass-throughs as well. I never think that 2 shots are exactly the same. So we may have hit opposite side shoulders. I know on one instance I definitely hit in the guts. So I don't want to go to say that this Broadhead isn't a good penetrator. I'm just saying in the 3 shots that we had, we didn't get any pass-throughs with it. The last con that I would talk about with the Rift 2.2 is the ferrule is pretty long. I don't know if this is actually a con, but I just feel like the longer the ferrule, the skinnier and the narrower that it gets, the more issues that could come into play with bending and not being able to use the Broadhead more than one time. I've had this experience quite a bit with Schwacker Broadheads where that long skinny tip at the end bends and then the blades won't retract back into the Broadhead, so you can just put a new collar on it and shoot it again, which can be an issue because Broadheads are not cheap. The NAP Thunderheads are 100% the most affordable out of these 3. I think they're $45 for a 5-pack, whereas these Rifts and the Crowns, well above $50 for a 3-pack. So when you're paying that kind of price, you expect them to be able to be shot through multiple animals. So I did briefly want to stop and talk about the arrow that I shot 5 out of 6 deer with last deer season, and that is the Exodus MMT. What I like about the Exodus MMT is the arrow is fully customizable and is tailor built to your setup. So your draw weight, your draw length, and comes exactly the way it should. Momentum is the #1 driver for penetration when you're shooting through an animal, and I shot 5 deer with these last season and got 5 pass-throughs. If you're fixing to head to the Total Archery Challenge and you need some arrows for that, these are a great option. Or if you're just looking for some great arrows for next fall, check out the Exodus MMTs at exodusoutdoorgear.com. And if you want to save some dough, make sure to use code HA15 at checkout for 15% off your purchase. The last Broadhead that I wanted to talk about is the Crown by Thorn Broadheads. As you can see, this Broadhead is pretty used. I think I still have meat from the buck that I shot with it. The first arrow that I shot this 6x7 over my shoulder with was the Crown by Thorn Broadheads. I was running an assortment of fixed blade Crowns and expandable Rift 2.2s in my quiver. Since both of these Broadheads shot pretty much exactly the same, I wanted to shoot each of them and test them out. I think it's just over a 1-inch cut, so it's fairly compact on its diameter and it flies extremely well. I will say this Broadhead was probably the best flying fixed blade Broadhead I've ever shot out of the box. I didn't do any tuning to my setup to make this 100 grain Broadhead shoot exactly like my 100 grain field points. I ended up hitting this 6x7 2 times because the first shot was at 25 yards. He ran out to 20 yards to my left and I delivered a follow-up shot with an expandable. The first time I shot that buck with the Crown was a hard quartering away shot and wasn't great shot placement. My arrow ended up creeping way closer to the shoulder than I originally intended and resulted in pretty poor penetration, but that could have been from a variety of different issues. I could have hit a weird part of the shoulder blade, the angle could have just been too steep, But regardless, I got pretty poor penetration. That deer ran out to 25 yards. I shot it with a Rift 2.2 and ended up recovering it about 295 yards later. When I went to clean the deer, I realized that the broadhead had deflected off of a rib or the shoulder and didn't even get into the cavity of the animal, so that wouldn't have been a lethal shot at all. I also shot this broadhead through a doe in Kansas at 32 yards, quartering away. Didn't get that on film, but absolutely crushed her. It was a pass through and it stuck into the dirt, and I was very happy with my experience right there. Jake also shot a deer with this broadhead last fall. I believe it was in December. He didn't end up getting it on video, but it was a complete pass through at 42 yards, and the arrow was coated with blood and looked great. So this was the broadhead that we had the least amount of experience with. And to be honest, one of the reasons for that was I did miss a couple does in Kansas last early season, and I lost one of my arrows and then bent one of these broadheads up quite a bit shooting at one of them. So I really just didn't have that many to test. Let's talk about some of the pros of the Crown Broadhead by Thorn. The first thing that I'd say about it is it's a mean looking broadhead. The blades that you insert into that ferrule are extremely sharp, and the broadhead has a narrow diameter, which creates less drag and makes it extremely accurate. If you hit the deer in the right spot, I think you're gonna have absolutely no issues getting pass-throughs with this. And I believe that my 6x7 that I shot in a hard quartering angle was an anomaly and not the norm. If you shot that shot 10 times, I think it would go differently. That's not what I would expect in a normal scenario in a good broadside shot. The only cons that I can think of is I got poor penetration in my only shot, but I really feel like that was of my own doing and my problem. I don't think any broadhead would have performed great in that scenario. And the last con that I would talk about is this broadhead is very expensive. I think it's $74 for 3 of them. I shot one into the dirt and bent several of those extremely sharp blades. That's kind of the double-edged sword of really sharp blades, right? To get extremely sharp, you have to be really thin. And when blades are really thin, they're easier to bend. So it's kind of a give and a take. But with something that's $75 for a pack of 3, you need them to last more than one shot. Closing up here, let's just talk about which broadhead that I'm gonna be shooting in the 2023 season going forward. So for whitetail, anything under 50 yards, I think I'm gonna stick with the NAP Thunderhead just because it's old, reliable, and I have to kind of side with my uncle here on the if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think it's extremely hard for whitetail to beat a good fixed blade broadhead in those shots that are under 50 yards. If I do end up going out west and needing something that's gonna fly maybe a little bit better at longer ranges, I think I would probably go with the Rift 2.2. It does fly extremely accurate, and I could see myself taking a broadhead like this to shoot something like antelope, where I'd be shooting 60, 70, possibly 80 yards in the right scenario. Before we wrap up the video, I did wanna say every single one of these broadheads will work. And pretty much every major broadhead manufacturer on the market is gonna make a pretty decent broadhead in 2023. A lot of what I said is personal experience and personal preference. Some of you guys may be a diehard expandable person and would never dream of shooting a fixed. And the other way around for someone that's shooting a fixed and would sell their firstborn son before they would shoot an expandable. If you're shooting above 40 pounds with a properly spined arrow and a decent 100 grain broadhead, you're gonna be able to kill most big game animals in North America with good shot selection and knowing your limits. And instead of spending your time arguing with people in forums or on TikTok about which broadhead is the best, spend that time shooting your bow and getting more proficient with your equipment, and that will serve you a lot better in the long run. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for checking out the video. If you do want to check out our merchandise page, we got the cool Funky Buck hats available right now. I think they're pretty sweet, and they come off of a buck that I shot in the 2021 season. So go check those out. That's huntersadvantagemerch.com. We really appreciate you guys watching the video, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.